Hello, welcome everyone to today to the start of a brand new webinar series that we are hosting called Science at the Edge. I'm your host, Kristan Uhlenbrock. I'm the director of the Institute for Science and Policy, a project here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. A huge thanks, obviously, to my team for helping bring this together and the many colleagues that are working behind the scenes. So as I mentioned, in this series, we're going to be talking about new ideas and innovations in science and technology and how it influences society. So this is the first episode that we're going to be bringing you, and we're going to be bringing you a whole broad range of topics over the coming months. In this very first episode, we are taking on this very hot topic that many of you probably heard of, which is generative AI or artificial intelligence and its impact on misinformation. Generative AI is that type of artificial intelligence that can generate text and images and other media in response to prompts that you've given it. Maybe you've heard of ChatGPT or DALL-E or one of these other language and image learning platforms. So we're going to learn a little bit about what these platforms are and how do they work today. But we're also going to learn about how it impacts and influences many aspects of our society, including misinformation. I do want to do just a quick pulse for those of you who've joined us today from all over the country. Welcome. About if you've actually used one of these platforms. So Nicole's going to throw up a quick poll here real quick about if you've used any of these generative AI platforms. There's a lot of them out there. These are just some examples. So just kind of want to see if yes, no, or actually, I don't know if I've used one before. So we're going to cover a lot of ground in the next hour, talking a little bit about how this technology is used in impacting misinformation, impacting kind of our media landscape, impacting the trustworthiness of information in this really heavily information saturated world. We're going to cover topics ranging ethics and policy and probably copyright and biases and all kinds of big, wonderful topics. We're not going to get to everything. This is a really big topic to take on, but we're going to cover some interesting areas and we're going to hopefully incorporate some of your questions throughout today. So as you heard Nicole say right before you joined here at the top of the hour, open the chat, ask your questions in the chat feature. I'm going to pull themes and questions from that and work them into our conversation. A huge apologies in advance if you have a very specific question and we don't answer it. We often get a lot of interest, and so we'll do our best throughout today's program to cover a lot of the questions that you have. But I'm going to bring in our guest and say welcome and hello today and hand this over to her. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Casey Fiesler joining us today. Casey is an associate professor in the Department of Information Sciences right here in our backyard at University of Colorado Boulder. She also has multiple affiliations with the Silicon Flatirons, which is the law school, as well as the Atlas Institute. Casey has a PhD in human-centered computing, as well as a law degree. And her work is primarily focused around technology ethics and law and online communities. She has also been actively engaged and a champion for broadening and empowering participation in computing. Thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Fiesler. Casey, how are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm great.
Good. Well, I'm excited. So we're going to have a little bit of a presentation, just kind of setting the stage. Around 10 or 15 minutes, we'll see how that goes, and then we'll head into a conversation. So let me pass this over to you and say, please take it away.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to be doing, as she said, a very short presentation here with the intention to explain what generative AI is and enough about how it works in very simplistic terms, with the goal of understanding types of misinformation that might come out of technologies like this. So I imagine all of you have seen a lot of headlines about this. Over the past year or so, especially, it was actually last summer that OpenAI's art generators, DALL-E and some others made by others than OpenAI also were announced and people started using them. And so that's when these headlines really started, but it really kicked off in December when ChatGPT was released. And if you are interested in keeping abreast of what's going on in this phase, I actually maintain this running spreadsheet of news articles about AI ethics and policy. And the reason I point this out is because how easy it is every day. There's something new. And it's all, about what's going on with AI and the new tech and that sort of thing. But a lot of it is around the ethical issues and the limitations of these technologies, which I think is really important for people to understand. And this all starts with how difficult it is to understand like what artificial intelligence is anyway, because that is such a broadly used and not always appropriately used term. I think that this cartoon is kind of funny. That maybe AI is just machine learning, it's just statistics. And so I actually thought that I would actually briefly start with explaining a somewhat simpler type of AI that you might be familiar with in order to help you understand the difference between that and what we're talking about now. So if you've ever heard of machine learning, we are encountering this constantly. When you hear about AI, or sometimes you hear about algorithms, this is what we mean. And so I will give you a very simple example here. Let's say that a computer has a data set of thousands and thousands of photographs of cats and dogs. Here's a cat, here's a dog, here's a cat, here's a dog. And then here's a picture of a dog. This is my dog, actually. Smart computer, is this a cat or is this a dog? And hopefully it knows that it's a dog. He is a little bit of a cat-like dog though, but probably 92% accuracy that this is a dog. But one thing that you might have heard a lot about when it comes to AI is people talking about bias. And imagine that training data, all the pictures of all the cats and all the dogs, lots of different kinds of cats, but every dog is a golden retriever. So all the dogs in the training data are golden retrievers, and you've got all these cats. Suddenly my dog might look more like a cat than a dog, because he looks more like a cat than a golden retriever, I think. This is how we end up with problems like this one that you might have heard about from Google a number of years ago. Bias in AI often comes because of bias in the training data. If you hear about garbage in, garbage out, that's where that comes from. Another example of this is, let's say that you are creating a hiring AI to help you decide who to hire. We know from decades and decades of resume audit studies that humans are sexist and biased, or sexist and racist when it comes to decisions about who to hire for jobs. So if that's your training data, then guess what? The AI is also sexist and racist. So this is not super surprising. So machine learning is finding patterns in training data and making predictions. That's what we've been seeing a lot of, and why, this type of, when you hear about AI in healthcare algorithms, that's what we're talking about. Generative AI is when, instead of like labeling things or predicting things based on training data, it's actually creating something new. It's generating something new. So now I can go to DALL-E and say, give me a dog, give me a cat. And these are dogs and cats that do not exist in reality. These are not actual photographs. They also weren't created by an artist. They were created because DALL-E is trained on, I don't even know, countless images of dogs and cats. So it's created a brand new dog or cat. And these are pretty simple, but I could also ask it, for example, for a dog and a cat wearing colorful knitted hats surrounded by balloons. I could also ask for a photograph of a dog and a cat in front of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and the cat's wearing a propeller hat and the dog is wearing a green sweater. But if you look closely at this, you'll actually see that there are some problems here. Like there's a propeller in the background of one of these. It's like and the hats aren't always quite right, and it looks a little weird sometimes. You can see how like the propeller might show up in a weird place. Like now the dog has like a helicopter on its head. And DALL-E is not the only system like this. Another one that you might have heard about is Midjourney. And typically when you see these like very beautiful, realistic images, that's where that's coming from. And again, can create things that do not exist in reality and nature. These are the kinds of things that you would have expected to have seen created by an artist out of their mind. But now I can go to Midjourney and create an image like this, essentially instantly. We can also create something that looks like a photograph of a person that does not actually exist, or actual people who exist but are doing something that they couldn't be, like Han Solo and Chewbacca with a smartphone. And you might be thinking, there's the start of the conversation about misinformation, and you would be right, but we're going to come back to this. Another thing that generative AI can do, if you've heard about some of the things that Photoshop with its new Gen AI capabilities can do, is like fill in the rest of a photograph. So if you've ever seen this meme, the boyfriend meme, that's just that square part in the middle is the meme, and the image generator filled in the rest of the scene. So that's image generators. You also might have heard about different types of text generators like Google's Bard, GitHub Copilot, which helps you write code. But probably what you've heard a whole lot about is ChatGPT. So ChatGPT is a large language model. I don't want to go into great detail about how this works. That would take me a much longer presentation. But the important thing to know is that it's not a search engine. It is, like, at a very simplistic level, a probability distribution over those same kinds of data sets. It would be more accurate to say that ChatGPT is fancy autocomplete than that it is a search engine. It is really hard for me to express just how good at this it is, but it is a prediction of what word comes next. But the way that it does that is so complicated and impressive that it really does seem like magic. But the important thing to know here is that it's not understanding what you're saying. It is predicting what word is most likely to come next. And this was done with a lot of different levels of learning, including reinforcement learning, which is where humans rated the responses that it was providing, and that went back in and to continue to train the model. So let me give you an example. I could ask for an itinerary for enjoying a day at the museum. Does this very well, actually, and actually gives you the correct address. Would not have given you the correct address if you had moved since 2020, though. Sometimes there will be things that seem a little bit off, but overall, based on my memories of the museum, this seems pretty good. Another thing that I could ask it to do is write a script for an opening scene of Star Trek: The Original Series where they visit the museum. ChatGPT is actually very good at writing fan fiction. Now, is it good fan fiction? Probably not, but the fact that you could tell it to do pretty much anything and it can do it is very impressive. Another thing that I tried out was I asked it to write a Wikipedia entry for me. I'm not on Wikipedia. But here's where it gets interesting. There are a lot of things here that seem right, but aren't. So you heard my bio earlier about my PhD and my law degree. It also says here that I have a bachelor's degree from University of Georgia. It's not. My bachelor's degree is from Georgia Tech. And I don't know if anyone knows about the rivalry between those two schools, but it's a very big mistake. It also provided citations, selected publications. All of the people here are people that I have written papers with. And these are topics that I study, but none of these papers exist. These are all completely made up titles of papers that I never wrote and don't exist. I also was not in Forbes 30 under 30, but it's actually a little bit flattering that for some reason this model thinks that I should have been. Here's where you see things start to break down, because again, it's not a search engine. It's about what word comes next. And this is these are papers that could exist because they sound right. Another thing you should not ask ChatGPT to do is to solve math problems for you. Here I was actually trying to show that it might be helpful for helping someone with their math homework. So I was like, hey, give me a math problem and don't give me the answer. So then I thought, maybe I could give it the wrong answer and it would correct me and tell me how to do it correctly. But instead I gave it the wrong answer and it was like, good job. So I pointed out then why those incorrect. I was like, does 2 times 4 plus 5 really equal 15? And by the end, is 8 plus 5 15? It was like, yeah, totally. 8 plus 5, 15. So you can see some ways that you might get accidental misinformation. This is very important for students to know about citations, for example. But there are also ways that you could use these technologies to generate deepfakes, for example. So these are two very famous examples from the past few months. Someone on Twitter created, before Donald Trump was arrested, created images of him being physically arrested and put them on Twitter and said, I made these. But then people started picking them up and posting them elsewhere. And the next thing you know, they're in news articles. Same here, we have the Pope with his like puffy jacket. Neither of these are real, but they fooled a lot of people. Now, deepfakes are not like, this is not a brand new thing that, you know, has come up in the past year. Just a couple of years ago, deepfake Tom Cruise went very viral. The image here on the right is the deepfake. This was actually posted on TikTok, and he sounds exactly like him. He looks exactly like him. You cannot tell that it is fake. But one of the reasons that they were able to do this so well was that the source material was actually a Tom Cruise impersonator. So you can see him on the left here. So they had a Tom Cruise impersonator like do this, and then, you know, lots of magic here to make this happen that required a lot of effort on the part to make a deepfake that was so good. The thing with the tools that have become popularized in the past year is how easy they are to use. So I did not create the Pope in the puffy jacket, of course, but you could do something like this very quickly. Now, the good news is that there are ways that you can spot deepfakes or just spot AI generated images at all. They often have weird little things. Sometimes sometimes they're not even little. Sometimes it's like someone has 3 arms, and it's amazing how you cannot notice those things until you're looking for them. But of course, you know, these are things that with a little bit of effort you can fix. And of course, people are trying to make the technology better every day. And then the other thing that I want to mention in terms of types of misinformation, so we have, you know, the unintentional stuff, the mistakes. We have people using these, you know, adversarially. And then there's bias in the system. So if you think back to the gorillas example from earlier, another thing is that I asked Midjourney to give me an image of a computer science professor, and it gives me 3 bald white men and, you know, bald white men lecturing to a room of bald white men. So there are potential types of representational harm. I always like to see, you know, we're going to get to physical robots that have these kinds of models integrated into them pretty soon. So imagine that a kid is like, you know, says to their like robot companion, I want to play dolls. Please go get me a scientist. And they always bring her Ken instead of Barbie. And this is what happens when these models are basically just a regurgitation of everything on the internet. So the last thing that I'll point out as we continue this conversation about ethics is that this is something that is really important for us to be thinking about right now, not just misinformation. I'm sure you can all name a dozen more ethical issues that are happening here. But there is a speed at which this is moving right now that I think is problematic. There are some ways that we need to pull back and make sure that we're not, as this person from Microsoft said, waiting to see what we need to fix later. It might be too late. The harm might already be done by then. You also might have heard a lot of calls for like slowing down AI or because we're worried about like these very existential risks like human extinction. My take on this is that it's a little bit of a distraction to be saying that what we really need to be worried about is human extinction when there are a whole lot of other things that are actual tangible problems that we know about and are happening right now. So anyway, this statement from the Center for AI Safety that that you might have seen recently, I would amend a little bit and say that we should mitigating the risk of AI should be a global priority, but I don't think that we should we need to think that far in the future yet, because right now there are a lot of harms that we already know about. And so I am going to leave it there, and looking forward to a good conversation.
Great. Thank you, Casey. Really great stage setting here. An audience member had a little bit of a technical question about the platforms, and then we're going to jump into a lot of openings you left us, which was about specifically in ChatGPT, but the idea of these things having modules or templates embedded within them. So if you gave them a prompt, for writing a script or something, are you going to see a similar template or module kind of coming out over the course of time? Or depending on that prompt, you're really going to see a really diverse variety?
You would probably see a pretty good variety, though I will say that ChatGPT has some memory. So if you are using your same account, it might give you some things that are very similar. The weirder something you ask for is, the more likely I think there is to be a lot of variation. There's like a particular style of speech though that you're getting out of it. I am finding that I can spot something written by ChatGPT much easier than I could 6 months ago. But no, it is definitely generating everything on the fly. Again, it is word by word. What word is next? So there aren't any like preset templates or that kind of thing, at least not in ChatGPT.
Great. And when you teach about this and you also have students engaging with you, I've heard people have concerns about plagiarism, and stuff. How could you talk a little bit about that and what you see as like the risk or not the risk around plagiarism? Because I know there's also tools there.
Yeah, so this has obviously been a huge topic of conversation, and I have to say it feels a little bit short-sighted to me that OpenAI released ChatGPT at the beginning of September or beginning of December, which was literally right when students were just about to do final papers and exams and that sort of thing. So teachers were very worried about this because there was no time for anyone to like react and adjust and figure out how to handle this. One way that I think about this is that, so ChatGPT and other technologies like this are a tool. So sometimes people will say to educators like, oh, would you keep your students from using a calculator? Would you keep your students from using spell check? And the answer is, of course not. But I would keep my students from using spell check if it was a spelling test. And so the difference here is you need to figure out when something is a spelling test and when it's not, if that makes sense. Like, should you, I think it's totally reasonable for educators to tell their students to not use ChatGPT in certain types of situations, but there are others in which it might be totally appropriate. Now, if we're worried about students cheating, which of course is a thing that happens, I've heard a lot of educators talking about how to adjust their ways of evaluating learning to make sure that that's not something that is feasible to do. Or, telling students that they're allowed to use it as long as they say how they used it and making sure that they're meeting certain types of learning objectives. There are detectors, but they're not very good yet. I've seen examples where people ran excerpts from the Constitution and through the Bible through these detectors, and they showed up as ChatGPT generated. So, and I worry a lot about false positives and this kind of thing. I feel the same way about plagiarism detectors, though. I think that a lot of educators spend far too much time trying to keep students who shouldn't get A's from getting A's and not enough time trying to make sure the students who should get A's do get A's. So I think that we're going to see some changes in education, but in the meantime, I hope that people are patient with educators and that educators are understanding of their students, not jumping ahead too much, not always assuming the worst.
I like that. How are you seeing these tools being used or taken up with the news media and journalists? I know certain newsrooms have policies and certain ones don't, and I can imagine it's a quickly evolving landscape. Do you have a good set on like how this isn't being used or some of the concerns in our journalism?
Um, yeah, so I'm not super worried about like actual legitimate journalists using these tools extensively, in part because the risk of incorrect information would be so strong. I mean, maybe they're using it to help edit the writing or that sort of thing. What I'm more concerned about are like news farms, blog farms, like the way that you could the way that you could, I mean, BuzzFeed News just went away, but like imagine, like, think back to like sort of the genre of BuzzFeed that was like, here's the top 20 blah blah blah. Like you could write 10 of those in 5 minutes using using ChatGPT. So I think, we're going to see that kind of thing, which again might not be intentional misinformation, but could, end up having some misinformation. The other thing that I imagine journalists are worried about, but also any kinds of writers, are uh, uh, job loss, and also like ways that their content is being used without their consent. Because if you've been a journalist for a while, then I guarantee you that your writing is in the training data for these models. And we've been hearing a lot about this from artists, but it's really true for anyone who's ever written anything on the internet.
So are there any copyright protections built in? Whereas, I mean, that's kind of a little bit of what you're alluding to some degree. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is that I think that uh legal issues around this and ethical issues around this are very different. I think those are two different things, and I feel differently about them, actually. So in general, my dissertation was actually about fair use. Um, and I'm actually very sort of pro fair use. Like I'm pro content reuse. I think it's important. I think that copyright law can sometimes be used to stifle creativity, and innovation. Um, and so the argument that OpenAI, or anyone who has made one of these models, would use is that their use of all of this data from the internet is fair use. Which is basically an exception to copyright law. It's what allows for, things like quoting a book in a book review, or, news showing images of things and this sort of thing. Probably the most related sort of existing precedent for this is Google Books. So Google was sued because of basically, scraping a bunch of books to create Google Books. And that was found to be fair use because they used books to make a search engine. And that was like considered to be a very different sort of like a transformation of the content. Here, what you're doing though is like using books to make books, which I actually think could be considered quite differently. But I think that the underlying ethical issue has to do with like using people's work without their consent, without attributing it to them, and in a way that could hurt those people, right? So if you are a stock photo artist, like your job is you take stock photos for a living, like I'm a little bit concerned. I don't think that AI is taking all of our, actually, sorry, I don't actually don't like it when people word it that way. AI is not taking your jobs. Humans are firing you. uh, but I don't think we have to worry about, job loss for everything from AI, but things like stock photo artists, or like artists who take commissions to create the covers for self-published books, like things like that. I think, if you're someone who wasn't going to pay a lot of money for something in the first place, could be replaced by using these image generators. And so knowing that, all of your art is like training the technology that could make you lose your livelihood is, I think, a significant kind of ethical concern, regardless of the legality of it.
I want to pick up on a few of these things as we go throughout some of that workforce stuff that you alluded to, but let me focus in on this ethical conversation, since that is definitely what a lot of your background is in. And when you were talking about, some of the ethical uses or not of it, are we talking about how do we ethically put some ethical boundaries around the platform and that conversation? Or are you thinking about users? Because those would be very dramatically different approaches. And when you have something open source, how do you put ethics, around that? So talk to me a little bit more about when you think ethically around these platforms, what are these big buckets and how do you think through some of these challenges that we should be talking about?
Yeah, so I think what you're getting at is, where are we looking at the responsibility here? Is it the people who are creating and releasing these technologies, or are we thinking about how people use it? So I've already heard of some. Oh, actually, I can think of even worse examples of this, but I'll go. So it's not to bring up bad things. I'll go back to misinformation, right? So if someone uses Midjourney to create an image of a politician doing something that they clearly they did not do, and then releasing it and pretending it's real, and that it impacts people and it affects an election, yes, it is obviously the fault and responsibility of the person who did that. However, I would argue that knowing that this is a problem, knowing that this is a particular kind of bad actor adversarial use case, that there is some responsibility on the creators of this technology to try to mitigate that harm as much as possible. And we've talked, like, a very obvious kind of thing is certain types of watermarks, including not something as as simple as like a image watermark that you could take off, but like embedded, like watermarks embedded into the metadata, into the code. And obviously there are ways around these things, but anything that you can do to add more friction to these kinds of negative uses of this technology, I think are really important. And at this point, we can't pretend like we don't know what the problems are going to be. They knew, like, before this was released. And actually, an interesting example is, so I showed you the Midjourney, the computer science professor example. DALL-E actually has a bias mitigation technique to prevent that from happening. So if you go to DALL-E and ask for an image of a computer science professor, it will not give you, so they have groups of 4 as well. It will probably give you 3 white men and 1 woman or Black man or something like that. The reason is because they know about the bias in their training data. They know that it's very likely that the results are going to end up skewing towards, frankly, white people for everything, or like stereotypes because of the training data. And so they actually append demographic features onto the end of search results for a small subset of the results. So what you would end up with is like computer science professors, 3 white men, and then it'll give you, the last result will be image of a computer science professor, Black woman. So that's something that they put into the design of the technology to ensure that those results were not as biased as they would be otherwise.
You mentioned the introduction of friction into this. What are some examples that we currently have or that you could envision helping with that?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So again, I think that watermarking, there are certain types of watermarking that it would cause additional friction to be able to remove it. Like I can't think of ways you would do it that it would be impossible to get around, but you can imagine ways of getting around it. I mean, I also think there might be some extent where I actually think the watermarking thing could potentially apply as well to people using these systems in deceptive ways. So like students cheating is another, example that people are really concerned about, and they really do want like detectors. And I do think that with some more work, there should be able to be some kind of actually accurate detector for these systems. The way that you end up doing that is like having basically certain types of statistical irregularities in the output that you could check for. And so adding friction to that, it would at least mean that you would then have to paraphrase it, right? Like, yes, you could paraphrase it. You know, I made some TikToks early on about its ChatGPT's tendency to fabricate sources, is like to make sure that like people knew that this was a thing, and you know, students could know that was a thing. And someone said like, oh well, you know, I know that I shouldn't use those sources. Instead, you know, I go find other sources that are like appropriate, and I cite those instead. And I was like, man, it sounds like you're like doing a big part of the assignment yourself. uh, so I think that would be an example as well.
Yeah, I want to say for you, giving you a little preview, Casey, in our audience, like as we get towards the end here, like what are the things we should be looking for? Like what are those tools and tips? So let's come back to that towards the end as far like that, those pieces of advice that you give people. But let me pull in a little bit of an audience question here, because it's a little bit in the frame of biases, which is the idea of a chatbot choosing each word, you know, and the phrases as what's next. Is it going to be reflective of just that, he says, the zeitgeist, right, the culture of the day, or is that going to be able to change over time?
Well, right now ChatGPT is based on training data that I think is not earlier than 2021. So again, it's not a search engine, so it's not like looking for new information. It's this model. I assume they will continue to be updated, of course. A concern that I've been hearing about recently is around model collapse, which basically means that if you took and I also, by the way, when I say ChatGPT, I'm using that because most people know what it is, but it's obviously ChatGPT is like the chatbot instantiation of GPT-3 and GPT-4, which are the actual models. But if you took actually, some researchers did this recently. They took GPT-3 and generated some output, and then further trained the model on that output, new output, trained the model again on that output. And within like 5 or 6 generations, it was just giving you garbage. So they referred to that as model collapse, basically the idea that like if AI is being trained off of its own output, over time it just degrades. Because like again, it's this like probabilistic model of what's happening, and so you're looking for essentially like statistical regularities in the data. And if you keep getting the same statistical regularities over and over and over again, they sort of compound and become gibberish. Whereas if you if you have human data that's created by human, it doesn't have those kinds of regularities because we are very irregular. So I additionally this is only slightly related to that question, but like I do have this concern that the more AI generated content we have on the internet, which like, I mean, it really could explode. I heard someone say recently, like, could we get to a point in the future where, you know, more of all of the content that we have access to is created by AI than was ever created by humans, which is like not outside the realm of possibility. So if we get to that point, and we're just training AI off of more that was created by AI, there's this, we're going to be just seeing the same kind of thing over and over, or potentially even just like down to garbage. I recently, so the creator of Black Mirror, Charlie Brooker, said that he had ChatGPT write a Black Mirror episode for him, and it was bad. The reason it was bad was because it was it was just like what you would expect a Black Mirror episode to be, because that's what it gives you, right? It's giving you what you expect it to be. That's the whole point. ChatGPT is just a jumble of tropes. It's not giving you, you know, things that are creative. And when I asked for, you know, Star Trek fan fiction set at the Denver Museum, and it can do that. You're like, wow, that's so creative. That wasn't it being creative. That was me being creative, right? Uh, and so I think that's something that's really important to know as well. So this isn't creativity. It's just this, a jumble of tropes.
I want to shift to talking, I want to do a little segue and then shift to talking about policy and regulation or not. But before I do, you had a bunch of headlines from news sources there at the beginning. You've talked a little bit about this, but for our audience and for myself, I'm quite curious on the spectrum, right? Feeling like things are exaggerated, and or we should be concerned. Where do you kind of fall on this? And and is our media also, where do you think they are falling on some of the current conversations based on some of the news headlines I've read?
So again, my take on the sort of AI safety crowd is that it's a little, and I say, so AI safety tends to be a little bit more concerned with this like existential risk, like the human race is going to go extinct because of AI. Um, I tend to find that distracting. Not everyone feels this way. There's actually a lot of disagreement in the sort of like AI safety ethics community. But I find that a bit distracting from the current problems. And one of the reasons I feel this way, this might be a slightly ungenerous interpretation, though there are some things that support this interpretation. Some of the folks who are involved in who are directly involved in the development of AI, like OpenAI CEO, have been very vocal about the importance of regulating AI, but then they are very specific that what they mean is regulating it to prevent human extinction. So like OpenAI put out a blog post about the importance of governance towards governance of super intelligence. We are like multiple steps away from super intelligence right now. So if you've heard about so narrow AI is like AI that does a very specific task, like the machine learning stuff that I was talking about, AI that can tell you what a dog is. And there's general AI, which is like AI that could do anything. We're not to general AI yet. And then beyond general AI is super intelligence, which is the idea of AI that is smarter and better in every way than humans. So anyway, OpenAI said that we should start thinking about governance of super intelligence because it's coming. But then in this blog post was like, but to be clear, we're not saying that you should be applying these regulations to what exists now. And so I just want to make sure that we don't get so focused on like regulating for the robot wars that we don't worry about things like misinformation and bias and these really like real harms. And I'm someone who thinks it's actually very important to look towards the future. But I think sometimes you get a little bit in the weeds, thinking that far ahead. Should we get to a point where there's some, like, the other thing is I don't hear people talking about like in what way humans are going extinct. Whereas I understand exactly what's happening with things like job loss and misinformation and bias.
So you were talking about, these conversations around policy and regulation and what the conversation is coming at from, the tech sector side and OpenAI side. There's this new act, an AI act that the European Union Parliament adopted, I think just this month or last month. Obviously, it hasn't completely passed, but it's expected to be approved this year. And I think some of the focus on it, from what I was reading, was on transparency and identifying those potential risks. To me, talk to us. Is this that first step in government for trying to figure out where and how it could potentially be used to regulate or to set policy? Talk to me about some of the challenges of regulating and creating policies, and where do you see opportunities in this conversation?
Yeah, so the AI act that is the like draft language for that was just passed in the EU and the European Parliament. So it is a risk-based framework. And so basically the idea there is that, each technology has its own sort of risk analysis, and then how it's dealt with and what kinds of restraints it has are based on that risk. So the idea is that some things might be so risky that they would be banned outright. Other things might, be required to have audits or something like that. And some things might be so low risk that they're barely regulated at all. So the specific example that I remember is that, and this has definitely not been decided, my understanding is that there is arguments over whether this would be the case, but an example of something I've seen that could potentially be banned under this regulation would be emotion recognition AI. That like AI that determines someone's emotion from their voice or their gait or their face. The benefits don't outweigh the risks of bias, for example, and misuses by law enforcement would be the example that comes to mind. There also, part of this also might be as well, like, oh, well, you can't use this in certain types of contexts, would be another example of regulation there. The US does not really have AI regulation yet. Last year, the White House Office of Science and Technology put out the AI Bill of Rights. It's called a blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights. This was worked on by some like very excellent people in the sort of like AI ethics and fairness space. And it's actually a really nice document that lays out a lot of concerns about AI. Now, interestingly, when I first started talking about this, a lot of people thought that I meant like rights for the AI. So not robot rights, but our rights, human rights in the context of AI. So things like certain types of consent requirements and transparency requirements and this sort of thing. I would like to see something like that be a blueprint for legislation. I mean, I think this is someone who, as someone who has a law degree and has done some like legal advocacy work, I tend to be a bit pessimistic about regulation. And like just the fact that we like barely have any data privacy regulation in this country, and it's been how long since this has been a huge issue, I'm a little bit skeptical. And part of this has to do with lobbying. I mean, the other thing that I saw recently is that OpenAI CEO, while like talking about how important regulation is, was like quietly lobbying the EU lawmakers against some of the things in the AI Act. And so unfortunately, a lot. So here's another big picture point when it comes to ethics and what's happening with AI right now. This has the ability to concentrate even more power in the hands of people who already have all the power. I think this is true because of the, small number of big tech companies that we have. Yeah, so this is what concerns me. And I think that that's one of the big obstacles for regulation, particularly in the US, is power differentials, which is, I don't know that I have a good solution to that, unfortunately.
But acknowledging it for sure. What about we had an audience member who was curious about any sort of regulation or structure or guardrails that we could put around data sets and the input side of it that is used to potentially create these products. You had already alluded to different versions of people putting in a bias check, in essence, around what gets produces the output. Is that being done, or is that still just individual companies and tech companies doing that within their own software?
Yeah, I mean, so and that's not even about the data set. That's like we know we can't fix the data set, so we're going to do this other thing instead, which I think is far more it is extremely hard, if not impossible, frankly, to debias data sets of this. Just the magnitude is hard to wrap your head around. Most of the conversations that I've been seeing around data sets have been around these like ownership and consent issues. I recently went to some of the listening sessions that the Copyright Office was having with like artists and authors and that sort of thing. And there are a lot of people who think that there should be like a licensing regime for AI. So like the way that music copyright is incredibly complicated, but one of the weird things about music copyright and like people getting paid is that there's an organization or multiple organizations, I think one of them is ASCAP, that basically takes in all of the revenue that should be paid to composers for things like their songs being played in bars and on the radio and that sort of thing. And as opposed to like, you know, a radio station having to like keep track of every song that they play and like giving, you know, 5 cents to that person, like how streaming works. This organization takes all of this money and then like doles it out to people based on how popular their song is at any given time, is a very simplistic explanation. But there's been discussions of that, like is like basically the idea here. And this again, I don't know about legally, but ethically, I feel this pretty strongly, which is I do think there's an issue with the fact that, you know, OpenAI, and again, I just keep picking on them because that's who everyone talks about, but they're not the only ones, created this immensely profitable technology that absolutely could not exist were it not for all of the input from all of these humans, you know, who created all the data that trains it without any kind of compensation. I mean, that said, you know, we've been talking a lot about all these ethical issues, et cetera. I'm not anti AI. I actually think that a lot of these technologies have the ability to do things that are pretty darn cool. But I think that if something is going to be as transformative and like change the world as much as people think that it's going to, it is incredibly important that we figure these things out so that we don't get to a place where it's done more harm than good.
I'm going to pick up on what you just said because we have a couple of different questions from the audience I'm going to weave together, which is, you know, humans, this person had a beautiful opening for their question, which was humans have this long history of developing new technologies and then sometimes struggling to ensure that the impacts are beneficial. And so is AI one of those? And another person's really curious, like, what is it really going to be useful for, right? And I'm wondering if, you know, you just said like you are actually pretty, you know, supportive of it in general, like what is the benefit of it to us?
Yeah, so I do think like we have seen this before. I think that this could be bigger than some of the ways we've seen this before, but I think that there are some similarities to, for example, the early days of the internet. I mean, if you think about think about how completely different the world would be if there were no internet. And if you look back at like the science fiction from like the mid 20th century, there was no internet and, you know, where's my flying car? But like this thing is pretty great. Uh, so I don't know that there's anything super different, but I do think it's pretty extreme. And you know, I do think that there are going to be benefits of this technology, like cool things that we can do with it. I lost track a little bit of your question.
The beneficial use, right? Like what
Yeah.
do we really think this is it really useful for? It's in a
Yeah.
huge advancement, but
Okay, so here, you know, okay. A lot of people are very concerned about job loss. And again, I think it's very important to remember that AI is not taking people's jobs. Humans are firing them. What companies are firing them? What companies so let's say that copywriting is now so much faster because of AI. Like you're like, okay, you know, we now only need one copywriter instead of 5. So we're going to fire 4 copywriters. What if you gave that one copywriter a 3-hour work week instead and paid them the same? Like AI should be able to augment what we're doing as humans so that it's faster, more efficient, and that sort of thing, so that maybe we don't have to work ourselves to death. Like, to me, that's, and I say this and I'm like, that's the dream that, AI is going to result in us being able to have shorter work weeks. Maybe we even get to the point, and very far in the future. But if AI continues to be as transformative as people say it will be, maybe we need universal basic income. Like, but I would love to see a world in which the it's not like, oh no, AI takes everyone's job, and instead it's like, what if we didn't have to work as much, but still like got paid a living wage? And which I think, I think that kind of thing is very challenging, but there are things that AI can do to help people with the kinds of work that we're doing. And that's how I would like to see it, as an augmentation rather than a replacement. And it's not going to write very good fan fiction. Like, I'm going to go read stuff written by real fan fiction writers.
All right, we're gonna try to wrap up here in just a few minutes, but for our audience, what are some ways or recommendations you'd give for people who want to cross-check the trustworthiness of some of this information, right? Like, what are those tips that you give people?
Yeah, well, some of this is like so simplistic, but you really do have to fact check ChatGPT, for example. Like, it's very important. If it's giving you any information that's of consequence, like, go search for it in the way that you would have searched for the information before, and maybe it will have now given you some keywords that will make that searching easier. When it comes to things like deep fakes, I would just, and this is the same thing that I would have said before it was as easy as it is to create them now. You just need to be incredibly cognizant of where information is coming from. Like, if you see an image on Twitter, like, why would you trust that that's true? Right. In the same way, people, I talk about this stuff on TikTok, and people will ask all the time, like, oh, all this educational content on TikTok, but like, why would you ever believe anything you hear on TikTok? Like, and it's not that you believe things because you hear it on TikTok, you believe because it's me. And that's why I, have my real name and my credentials there. And when I tell you something about AI, like, maybe you believe it, but some like random person with 0 followers and you have no idea who they are, why would you believe them? And that is just what we need to apply to everything now, unfortunately. And so we really need to be able to figure out how the source of information is credible or not.
Great. Casey, let me give you kind of final word here. What should we be paying attention to next in this space? Like, where are you spending a lot of your time thinking, and that you think some of us should be thinking a little bit more critically about?
Yeah, I mean, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about basically exactly what you just asked me about. I think that if people have an even better understanding of how these technologies work, they can have a better understanding of their limitations. And so that's what I think is really important right now, is this education around, like, what are these systems? Like, again, very simplistically, but it's fancy autocomplete, not magic. And I think that that's really important for people to understand. And also, in some ways, it might make them less scared of some of these, like, really, like, the world is probably not ending tomorrow, which I think would be a good thing for people to not think right away.
There's a lot of hard problems in the world and society, right? And I think it's kind of, how do we find the ones that we can deal with right now and focus on those, and work on everything collectively together. And you're right, like, focus on the things that we need to focus on today to fix. Casey, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was a big topic, and I think you covered it brilliantly and hit on a lot of the subject areas. We didn't get to, nearly half the questions that we had from our audience, but we had some amazing ones. So a huge thank you for joining us today. It's my great pleasure to spend some time with you and get to know you and talk about this before today as well. Huge thank you, obviously, to our audience for joining us. Nicole dropped in some links to the chat. We'll send those out in an email, as well as a follow-up if you want to share it with any kind of colleagues or friends or family who you think would find this of interesting to watch. We'll come back for another episode in this series at the end of July 31st. So mark your calendar. We're going to take on another interesting topic, which is the topic of carbon capture technology. And I'm guessing we'll probably come back to this AI conversation. There's so much here to unpack as well. So thank you all for joining us today. Great to see many of you, and a huge thank you, obviously, to Dr. Fiesler for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.